I just finished writing a treatment for a job and I don't see people talk about them very much, so I thought I'd try and do that here.
Good luck.
You probably already know that screenplays have really specific formatting guidelines. There's definitely some wiggle room there, but in general, scenes need to have slug lines and your dialogue needs to be centered down the middle, and a feature script should be like 85 to 115 pages. Treatments, however, have very few standards at all. Some treatments are like 4 or 5 pages, and some are like 40 or 50, and that lack of form can make it a little intimidating if somebody wants you to write one, or even if you're just trying to write one for yourself. So let me attempt to define what a treatment is. It's kind of like a long, really detailed synopsis, except that in addition to telling you what happens, it also gives you a really clear idea of what the tone and the style are, maybe the theme, and maybe some relevant backstory or context. Unlike an outline, they're usually written in kind of a prose type manner so the reader can get a good idea of how the movie flows. For this reason, and also because it's easier to convey tone through prose, I actually use treatments as my outlines even when I'm writing on spec. For me, treatments have 2 big advantages over other forms of outlines. First, because they convey tone better than most outlines would, I can get better and more accurate feedback from anybody who reads them. Second, although they're a little bit more work up front, my first drafts tend to go much more quickly as a result, and the overall time spent writing is less. I start my treatments after about 2 to 4 weeks of brainstorming, and during that brainstorming phase, I'm just jotting down a ton of notes in a Google Doc until I've got like 20 or 30 pages of research and character ideas, and they're all just starting to reach a critical mass. By that time, the basic shape of the story is apparent, I know lots about the world and the characters, and so I take those core beats that I figured out and I open up a new document and I start on that treatment. This is the treatment that I did for Control, a spec that I wrote in early 2023. It's being shopped right now, so I'm hiding a lot of the basic details, but this is the general layout that I like to use. I start with the title and the logline, and then I drop down and create a separate section related to the theme because I like to get that front and center since it's useful to me as I write, and it's also kind of helpful to anybody else who might be reading it as it kind of gives them some context for what they're about to read. For Control, I was delving into some potentially hot political issues. Although I wasn't necessarily shying away from them, they were more of the background of the story that I was trying to tell as opposed to the meat of it, so I wanted the producers who were reading the treatment to know what type of movie this would be. As a result, I made a separate section for that here. Most of my treatments don't have that section, but I've added similar sections in the past to provide other types of context up front, and if you have a need for something like that, it's totally cool to do it. Next, as with every treatment, I dive into the characters. Typically, about 4 to 7 of them show up in this section. I don't need everybody, just kind of the people who are really driving the story. I give some backstory and personality traits here, and I also lay out what they care about. Sometimes I'll give a hint of a flaw or perhaps a dark secret, and this is my own thing, but I like to make the prose flow from one character to another, kind of like this bit here. It's a nightmare scenario if there ever was one, and it's only about to get worse thanks to Sky Mustela. Again, this is a document that's meant to be read, and so I want every single piece of it to be engaging. If I can provide little hooks here and there or ways to make it flow better, I'm gonna do it. Once my main characters are wrapped, I move on to the meat of the treatment, the story. There are lots of ways to structure a movie, but for the typical kind of high concept commercial genre movies that I write, there are like 10 beats that I really want to have locked before I start my treatment. That's another me thing. Blake Snyder had 13 of them, and there are plenty of other people who do it plenty of other ways, but for me, I really want to know the following. I want the opening image or scene, I want the inciting incident, I want the break into Act 2, and I want the pinch point or the point where, the stakes raise at about page 45. I definitely want the midpoint, I want the low point, I want the break into Act 3, I want this crisis of conscience in Act 3, and I want the climax. And then at the very end, I want to know what the denouement is and kind of what the very last shot is. I'm not going to define all of these things here, but I've talked about all of them in other videos of mine, and I talked about most of them in the video on Shrek, which is like 6 minutes, and it should be somewhere up here if you want to take a look at it for a refresher. Once I have these beats, I drop them all into the treatment in bold, and then I basically just fill in the gaps with some lean prose. My goal here is not to explain every single scene or moment. Most of the scenes will probably wind up in there, but what I really care about is immersing my reader in the story. I want to fill these gaps with twists and turns and great character moments and things that they have never seen before. I want things in here that would belong in the trailer. And I also want anybody reading it to really get the tone that I'm going for. Just as importantly, I'm using this treatment as an opportunity to make sure that everything flows together and makes sense. I want to know that all the right connective tissue is there. This is way easier to see with the bird's eye view of a treatment than it is when you're into the details of a script. In general, I do flesh things out a lot in this stage, and so my treatments tend to be a pretty good size, usually like 15 pages and maybe 7,500 words. Sometimes though, I'll have a really good idea for a scene or a sequence and I know how it will affect the movie, but I haven't really figured out everything that goes into it yet. What I've learned is that spending too long on a small section of the treatment is a big waste of time, so if I can summarize that section that I haven't figured out yet, I'll do that and I'll move on. For instance, let's say I was writing The Matrix and I knew that there would be some training sequences for Neo, but I didn't quite know what they would be yet. I might write something like, using the Nebuchadnezzar's technology, Morpheus plugs Neo in and downloads a number of skills into his brain. We get sequences where he learns Kung Fu, and maybe he learns how to use weapons, maybe he even learns how to fly a helicopter, and basically all in no time at all. As long as the treatment isn't flooded with that kind of thing, and the general shape of the story is consistent and solid, I might actually just leave it like that and go straight to the script. That summary gives me enough to work with that I can be pretty confident that I'll figure it out as I go along, and importantly, it also gives anybody reading it enough to understand how it's going to set up all the sequences to come and how that sequence itself might be pretty cool too. This is a style thing, but once I've gotten everything written, the story section can be a huge block of text. I don't want somebody's eyes glazing over on me, so I like to make one or two things pop on every single page. I do this by drawing out a few words or maybe a single sentence in which something major happens and then putting that on its own line in bold. I do this with major beats like the inciting incident or the midpoint. I also do it a few more times just so that somebody who's reading through the document could almost just scan the bold bits and see the entire story. When that's done, I give it a read through, I make sure it makes sense, fix any typos, make the revisions I need to make, and then I fire it off to a few friends and my manager for their feedback. Although I don't typically do second drafts of treatments unless I'm making major changes, that feedback is really helpful as I move into that first draft of a script. And that's pretty much it. I write treatments for every single script these days, and it's been a great improvement to my process. So if it sounds like something that could help you out, give it a try. And if you're enjoying the videos like this one, definitely hit those like and subscribe buttons because as we all know, moving that mouse burns calories. Thanks so much everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.